Hey, welcome again to Hope Church Online. My name is Jason. I'm the lead pastor on staff. And if this is your first time with us, or if you came to our Christmas services and thought you'd check out a regular service at Hope Church, you picked a great Sunday to be here. Today, we are beginning a 5-part series called Trigger Happy. Now, are there people in your life who drive you crazy? Who annoy you, who frustrate you, who get under your skin, who offend you? Now, don't write any names in the chat. It could be someone you work with, someone who lives down the street. Maybe it's someone you read about in the news. It could be a political figure. Are there people who offend you in your life today? It's interesting how 2020 made more of those people. Now, there's a couple reasons why this happened. The first reason is because there used to be only 2 topics that you were not supposed to talk about in polite company. What were they? You're not supposed to talk about politics and religion, because if you do, people will get offended and get upset with each other. Well, in 2020, we added a third category that you're not supposed to talk about or people will get offended: science. Now, 12 months ago, I didn't know anyone who was an expert in the science of virology. Today, I know dozens of people who know all about virology. Now, in their defense, they did watch 2 YouTube videos and they listened to an entire podcast. Hashtag virtually a virologist, hashtag science expert. So now, instead of just politics and religion, we've got this unholy triad that includes science of things that offend people and make people argue. And the second reason why it's easy to let people get under our skin nowadays is because our whole culture has moved in that direction. People are easily offended today. People are quick to take offense. In fact, if you do one thing that people don't like or disagree with, they will cancel you. And we live in this world where everyone is so quick to be offended by what anybody else does. Now, when I look around and I see this, I'm not nearly as concerned about the fact that the culture around me is doing it as much as I began to notice in my own life in 2020, I began to take offense easily. I began to take offense at things that literally have nothing to do with me. So I started paying attention to the things that offend me, and here's what I noticed. A couple months ago, our oven at home broke. Now, this was an 11-year-old oven. And when I bought it, I thought, this is a great investment. Let's get the nice one, because my grandmother used the same oven for 40 years, and hers was built in 1947. So if I buy an oven built in 2009, this thing's going to last like a century. Let's get the nice one, and what a great investment that'll be until it broke 11 years into ownership. So I went to YouTube to figure out what to do, hashtag Appliance Expert, and it turns out that the control board that governs the system was broken. So I tore into the oven, I opened it up, I took it out, and I said, this is the part I need to replace. So I looked online for a new control board, and it turns out the manufacturer doesn't make that board anymore. But I could buy a used one on eBay for $750. Not a used oven, a used board for the oven. Or I could take the board and ship it to a company in Ohio that may or may not be able to fix it, and there are no guarantees if they try, but I'm paying them either way. So guess who I'm offended at now? General Electric. And then there was a Friday night where I was tired and I was going to get to sleep in on Saturday, and I was so excited to sleep in until 4 in the morning. I hear a chirp. And I hear a chirp because the battery in the smoke detector died at 4 a.m. And I thought, why don't they make batteries that die at 4 p.m.? Why do they always die at 4 a.m.? So now I'm offended by Duracell. And now this was supposed to be a big year in the life of my family. Our oldest son got his license, he started driving, and much to his disappointment, he inherited La Fonda. Now, if you don't know me, La Fonda is my Honda. It's a 1997 Civic that I have driven for 21 years, and now that my oldest has his license, he inherited La Fonda. And what car should I get now? Well, that was easy. I'm going to get myself a new Civic. These cars are awesome, but a few months into ownership, the check engine light came on. There was a problem with the emission system. I had to take it back to the dealership, and it took them 4 days to figure it out and repair it, which means my brand new Civic has been in the shop for repairs the exact same number of days that my 21-year-old car has been in the shop in its entire life. So now I'm offended, of course, by Honda. And then one day I took my Honda to the gas station to fill it up, and my wife asked me to go inside and get some milk and bananas. So now you know which gas station we're talking about. And I did something that I'm not supposed to do, I'll admit that. I left the pump running while I went into the store. Cover the ears of your children. Now my wife was in the car. I thought it'll be fine. The pump always shuts off anyway. What's the big deal? When I came back out with my milk and bananas, the pump almost shut off. It had somehow slowed to a trickle and was slowly trickling in more and more gas, even though the tank was full. So I had gasoline sheeting down the side of said Civic, and there's about a quart of gas maybe on the pavement underneath it. So now who am I offended by? Well, I would be offended by Quick Trip, but my wife won't let me be offended by Quick Trip. She's a pretty big fan, but it's on notice. It's on notice. But here's what I noticed in all of these circumstances, and I haven't even told you about the things that have to do with family members or politicians or my actual insecurities. But what I noticed this year about myself is this. If you're looking for offense, you will find what you're looking for. If you're looking for offense, you will find what you're looking for. And people these days are offended by pretty much anything when they're looking for it. People are offended by what the president tweeted. People are offended about the labels that Twitter put on the president's tweets, warning that they might not be accurate. People are offended about whether or not restaurants use plastic straws. People are offended by masks or no masks. People are offended by the feud between Taylor Swift and Kanye West. I know that one's a burr underneath your saddle, but people are easily offended by everything these days. Now, when I noticed that I was taking offense, it didn't start by noticing how easily I was being offended by things. It started by noticing that I was exhausted. As we were going through 2020, I noticed I'm really tired. I'm worn out from this year. I'm exhausted. And at first, I said, of course you're exhausted, Jason. It's a tough year for everyone. It's a challenging year for everybody. And as a pastor, there's lots of people to minister to in this season. And I've never led in a season like this before. And if you lead anything, you've never led in a season like this before. I thought, of course I'm exhausted. What else would I be? But something didn't add up in my own mind, because if you were to come to me and say, hey, Jason, we need to take everything you're doing, scrap it and redesign it, and you need to get the same results or better, that actually wouldn't bother me. I'm weird. I'm wired that way. I would love the challenge and I would dive right into that. So I thought, what's actually going on here? So I began to think about it and pray about it, and God began to reveal to me that the reason why I'm exhausted is because I keep picking up offense. And the more offense I was picking up, the more exhausted I became. Let me illustrate it this way. When Kathy and I started in ministry, I took a position at a church in Boise, Idaho, and a couple of guys in the church asked me if I wanted to do some wilderness backpacking with them. Now, I love the mountains, I love hiking, but I had never been on a true wilderness backpacking experience. We were going to go completely off trail. We were going to bag some 10,000-foot peaks in the Sawtooth Mountain Range, just a beautiful area. So I was all excited. So I bought myself a new backpack. I loaded it with gear, threw it in the back of the Jeep. We made the 3-hour drive to the mountains, climbed an old Jeep trail, and when the Jeep got to the top of the trail, we parked it, and I opened up the back, and I grabbed my backpack. And it was all filled with all my gear, so I put it on, and we set out into the woods, into the mountains, and never looked back. Now, when I put this baby on, I'm telling you what, I just felt empowered. I felt so strong because I wasn't just hiking anymore. Look at me, I'm a backpacker, and it's 35, 40 pounds in my sack, but I didn't care. I felt powerful because all those fools on the trails, they're not doing what we're doing. We're backpacking. So I take off with these guys, and about an hour into the trip, I start to feel tired. I'm not used to having this weight on my back. The shoulders get tired. I try shifting the weight around on my hips, and that doesn't help. And about 2 hours in, I notice I'm starting to trip over rocks and trip over roots, and that's not normal. I'm used to hiking, but without any weight on. Now, about that time, we decided to take a break, so I take off my pack, and I'm telling you what, as soon as I took off my pack, I felt like a feather. I felt so light, so free to take that weight off, and the sweat on my back began to dry in the air, and I just felt incredible. And after resting about 15 minutes or so, when I put this pack back on, I didn't feel powerful this time, and I didn't feel strong this time. Now my muscles had cooled off, and now it really felt heavy. And I start trudging along through the wilderness, and to make matters worse, one of the guys I was hiking with, Dave, he's twice as old as me, and he was born and raised in Idaho. He's half human, half mountain goat, and I could barely keep up with this guy, and I'm kicking more rocks and tripping over more roots, and finally, at the end of the day, we get to the place where we set up base camp, and I took this pack off, and when I took it off that time, I didn't feel light that time. Do you know how I felt? Just exhausted. I felt drained from carrying around this weight on my shoulders and on my back all day long. And that's how our bodies work with physical weight. If you put on 30, 35, 40 pounds, that wears you out. In fact, for some of us, your goal this new year is to lose 20 pounds, lose 25 pounds. And if that's you, I think that's a great goal for your new year, because if you drop some of the physical weight you're carrying around, you will feel fantastic. You will feel light. You will feel easy. You'll feel great. That's a great goal. But what about the weight that we carry around in our souls? What about the weight that we carry around in our inner life? What if we could put that weight down this January and begin to live an inner life in our souls that is light and easy and free? Because every time I pick up offense, every time you take offense, what we're doing is we are adding a burden, we are adding weight to our inner lives, and we are adding weight to our souls. So my goal for us in this series, and I will tell you right out of the gate, this is a big goal. This is an unapologetically ambitious goal, but my goal is that we would be people who learn how to stop taking offense. That we would learn how to become people who are unoffendable. That all the people and events and circumstances in our lives that trigger anger, trigger frustration, that cause you to take offense, that are annoying, that all those triggers in your life today would be changed, and that they begin to trigger gratitude in your life. That they would trigger an actual sense of peace and well-being in your life, that they would trigger happy in your life. That we would learn how to become the most unoffendable people on the planet. People who live light, people who live free, people who live with a soul like a child that is light and free from taking offense. Because the world around us is not going to suddenly change this year. Culture is not going to change this year. Public figures are not going to stop acting in their own interests rather than in the interests of the common good this year. That's still the world we walk out and still the world we live in. We walk out into that world and live in that world every day, but in our inner lives, we can learn how to drop the weight of taking offense and live lives that are free. Now, as I say that, there's possibly a couple reactions in your mind. Some of you, you don't even know if that's possible. You would say, Jason, are you telling me it's possible to never be offended? I don't even know if that's possible. When I look at everything that's wrong with our world, everything that's unjust in our world, some of the people in our world, are you telling me it's possible to never be offended by anyone? And now if you want to argue that point, you can argue that point, but your argument's not with me, because what I'm going to show you in this series is that this is not my idea. This was Jesus' idea. And the way of following him is a way that allows us to not pick up offense and carry that weight ever again. So some of you don't think it's possible. Some of us, we don't want to stop taking offense Because when you take offense, you feel like I did when I put on that backpack for the first time. You feel empowered. You feel strong. Look at me. I'm the barometer of everything good and right and true, and he's wrong and she's wrong and they're wrong, and look at me. I'm right. And when you take offense, it builds up this identity that you have of being the good person, the right person, the wise person, and you feel good about it. But if that's you, and if you like taking offense, or if you feel that's the right or the proper response to living in a broken world, I'm willing to bet that you're feeling pretty tired. I'm willing to bet that that's wearing you down. And I'm willing to bet that you're not experiencing a high level of peace and happiness and joy and gratitude in your inner life as you are someone who takes offense. So, with the balance of our time today, my goal is very simple. I want to share one big idea with you today, and then we're going to build on it for the next 4 weeks of this series. Here's what I want you to know today. God is inviting you to an unoffendable life. God is inviting you to an unoffendable life. God is inviting us to become the most refreshingly unoffendable people on the planet that seems to spin on an axis of offense. Now, just to make sure that we're on the same page and you're picking up what I'm putting down, I want to take a minute and I want to define what I mean by offense. What do I mean when I talk about taking offense? So here's my definition of offense. Offense. Something the Chicago Bears do not have. Oh, I'm sorry, that's offense. The Chicago Bears don't have offense, and some of you are offended by my joke. You should be. Their offense really is offensive. So here's my definition. By the way, I didn't even grow up here. I mean, this is just low-hanging fruit. It's right there. But here's the definition of offense. Annoyance or resentment brought about by a perceived, this is interesting, it's perceived. It could be real. It could just be perceived. It's an annoyance or a resentment brought about by a perceived insult or disregard for oneself, standards, or principles. A disregard for oneself or one's standards or principles. Now, there's a common theme that's carried by several biblical authors. This is not an isolated idea in the Bible. And the common theme is that taking offense, picking up that annoyance or resentment, taking offense is a choice. And it's a choice you make a dozen times a day, but it's a choice and you choose whether or not you pick up offense. I want to start in the Old Testament. We're going to look at several verses today with an incredibly wise man named Solomon. And here's what he wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. He said, "Do not be quickly provoked." Now, today we don't use that word. We say triggered. But Solomon said, "Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, in your inner life." Don't be triggered with emotions like anger or frustration or annoyance. Don't be triggered that way. He says, here's why. For anger resides in the lap of fools. So are you easily provoked? Are you quickly triggered? Do you pick up that offense? Solomon says something, I would never say this, I don't have the courage to say this, but Solomon says there's a reason why you're quickly provoked. And the reason why, as he says, is because you are a fool. Now, maybe he was having a bad day. Maybe he was in a bad mood that day. Well, let's look at the book of Proverbs, chapter 29. It says, "Fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end." In other words, there's an inverse relationship between anger and wisdom. If you think of someone who gets angry easily, you probably don't think of that person as being a wise person. Conversely, if you think of someone who's wise, you probably don't see the quality of anger in that person. Solomon said, it's fools who are triggered easily. It's fools that take offense easily. It's fools that are angered easily. Wise people bring calm into their environment. Now, this is the reason why James, the brother of Jesus, wrote this in the New Testament, James chapter 1. "Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger. Why should we be slow to become angry? Because human anger, that's your anger, that's my anger, we're humans. Human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Anger does not lead to godliness. There's no connection. There's no direct flight. Anger does not lead to righteousness. Anger does not lead to godly outcomes in your life. Now, I wanted to illustrate this idea that we see in the teachings of Solomon and we see in the teachings of James. And to do that, I brought out this Jack-in-the-Box. Now, some of you haven't heard a word I said because you've been staring at this toy the whole time, because this is the most disturbing and frightening toy ever made in the history of the world. In fact, even the advertising on this Jack-in-the-Box is a little misleading. If you look at the guy on the tin, that looks like a happy, friendly clown. But when I actually look at the clown who pops out, he looks like he wants to hurt me. But here's why I think this toy is the best illustration for what Solomon is teaching and for the world we live in. We live in a world where people are going to turn your crank. And when they turn your crank, what's going to happen? Okay, is anyone else like morbidly terrified right now? Okay, you're not even in the room. I'm holding this thing and you're just watching on your screen. But what happens is we live in a world where people turn the crank, and eventually, after they turn the crank long enough, a clown pops out. Does that describe you? Or someone turns a crank until a clown pops out? Now imagine if this clown popped out and started yelling at me and saying, well, the reason why I popped out is because you turned the crank, and if you hadn't turned the crank, I wouldn't have popped out. But that's not exactly accurate. Do you know why a clown popped out of here? A clown popped out of here because, this is deep, a clown was in here. And the clown was in here just waiting for someone to turn the crank, and then when I turned the crank, then the clown popped out. Are there people who turn your crank? You can't control that. We live in a world where people are going to turn your crank, but whether or not a clown pops out is entirely up to you. And if a clown pops out when someone turns your crank, Solomon and James said the reason why is because you are a fool. Now, you know who's figured out this dynamic? Marketers and the media have totally figured out this dynamic. This is why when I was a kid, headlines in the news told you what the article was about. Today, they're framed in a way that turns a crank so that you get angry, it agitates something inside of you, and you click through because that's the clown acting out. If we were a culture that took no offense, headlines would just say what the story is about. Now, as an aside, this is the reason why conspiracy theories gain traction. It's not because they're based in fact, it's because they're designed in a way that turns people's cranks, and sometimes a clown pops out. I think of a recent example from 2016 with a conspiracy theory called Pizzagate. The theory was that Hillary Clinton was operating a child sex trafficking ring out of the basement of a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. And a man in North Carolina, father of a couple of kids, picked up on the conspiracy theory, and it turned his crank because he didn't like Hillary Clinton, and it turned his crank because he wanted to protect kids. So one day in December, he grabbed an assault rifle and a pistol, drove to Washington, D.C., stormed into the dining room as the guests ran out of the door, went to the back and started looking for the basement where the children were kept. He shot locks off doors, explored every corner of the building, and as the police surrounded the building, he suddenly realized there was no basement, and there were no children, and this was just an ordinary pizza restaurant, and someone had turned his crank until a clown popped out. Solomon said that anger resides in the lap of fools. And when someone turns our crank, we are the ones who get to choose what's going to pop out of us. We get to choose whether or not we assume the burden of offense. Now, that's why the Apostle Paul, also in the New Testament, wrote this in Colossians chapter 3 about the matter. He said, "But now you must also rid yourself." That you take this out like last week's garbage. You must rid yourselves of all such things as these. Now, there's more than these, but he's giving us some examples. Anger, get rid of it. Rage, get rid of it. Malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Paul says you are the one who has the choice to get rid of anger, to get rid of offense, to drop that weight and live with a light and free, healthy inner life. Now, he was just expounding on something that biblical authors had been teaching for centuries. And one of the places we see this is in the Old Testament book of Jonah. Perhaps you know the story of Jonah and the fish, but in chapter 4, something interesting happens, an interesting conversation between Jonah and God. You see, early in the book, God had told Jonah to go to Nineveh to tell the city to repent. Jonah didn't want to. That's when he ran away. That's when the big fish came and spat him back out on shore where he had to go to Nineveh and speak God's word to them. And when he did, they repented. And when they repented, Jonah was furious because Nineveh, they were a violent people. They were a sinful people. They were a godless and wicked people. And they were a direct existential threat to Jonah's people, the Hebrews. They were enemies, and the Ninevites were far more powerful and sophisticated. They were more powerful and sophisticated in their military might, and Jonah's people were at risk. So he was mad, and when he was mad because God was patient with them, because God was merciful to them, God came to Jonah. Here's what happened, Jonah 4, verse 4. The Lord replied, "Is it right for you to be angry?" Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? But God, they are a sinful people. I'm God. I'm aware of that. But Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? But God, they are wicked and violent. I'm God. I'm aware. But Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? But God, they're a threat to my people and they are godless. And God says, Jonah, I am far more aware of this situation than you are. But Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? Because Jonah, wasn't it just 2 chapters ago in your story that you needed me to be patient with you? That you needed me to be merciful to you, that you needed me to be kind to you, that you needed me to be gracious and forgiving to you. Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? You see, when someone does us wrong, we're so quick to point out what they did was wrong, what they did was hurtful, what they're doing is bad for America, whatever it is. But God would ask you and God would ask me, but is it right for you to be angry? I'm God. I know it's bad. I know it's wrong. I know it's foolish. I know whatever it is. I'm God. I know far better than you do. But God's question is it right for you to be angry? Because you see, according to Jesus, you and I are as morally guilty of the very same sin that the people who offend us commit. People lie to me. I could take up offense, but I've lied to people too. People mislead me, but I've misled people too. People hurt me, but I've misled people too. And I could go out there and get mad at all the murderers, but Jesus said that if I hate someone, that's the same thing as murder in my heart. I am morally equal to a murderer. Whatever someone else has done that offends me, I have also done it, and or I am absolutely capable of doing that with what lives in my heart. So, do I actually have a right to be angry? Do you actually have a right to be angry? Because to take offense at what other people do that's wrong, that's to take God's place and elbow him out of the way and say, God, I'll do the judging from here on out. I will be the one to take offense. Now, Solomon said something interesting about a better way to deal with offense than to pick it up and hold on to it. In Proverbs chapter 19, verse 11, here's what he wrote. A person's wisdom yields patience. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. Overlook an offense. What does overlook mean? To raise your eyes to something better. To look beyond it. Not focus on that offense right in front of us, but when offense happens, not to focus on it, but to lift our eyes and look beyond it. And what is it that we are to look to? The answer is Jesus. Because if it's to our glory to overlook offense, then we see this modeled by Jesus better than anyone else. Because when Jesus was being crucified, when Jesus' hands and feet were being nailed to a cross, he prayed a prayer for the people who were nailing him to the cross. And this isn't just a prayer he prayed for them, this is a prayer he prayed for you. And his prayer in Luke 23 was this. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. You see, Jesus was the only one who was morally superior. He lived a sinless, blameless life as the Son of God, and he lived that perfect life, always glorifying the Father, yet it is to his glory to overlook an offense. And when he was being crucified by these people, and he was being crucified for my sin and yours, he prayed that God would forgive them, that God would forgive us. Not condemn us. It is to his glory to overlook an offense, and that's exactly what Jesus did to pay for our sins on the cross. And when I think about that, when that sinks in, I'm just too busy being thankful to Jesus for everything he's done for me to have time to take offense at this small thing that someone else has done in my life. It's hard to take offense when you're too busy being incredibly grateful at what Jesus has already done for you. It is to your glory to overlook an offense. And that's why Jesus gives you this invitation. The last verse I want to look at today is Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, and this is what I want you to hear from Jesus today. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." My yoke is easy and my burden is light. Are you feeling worn out from carrying offense, from carrying the burden of being angry and being the barometer of morality? Are you worn out and exhausted from that? Jesus says, come to me. Follow my way. Follow my path. Put your trust and faith in me and follow me, because I have the way to live that is easy and light. Jesus invites you to follow him and live a life that you can live freely and lightly. Now, there are so many details we have to unpack over the next few weeks. Does that mean you're okay with sin? Does that mean we're passive and we don't do the right thing? No, not at all. Here's what it means. It means if someone cuts in line in front of you, you can take appropriate action without taking offense. If a politician's out there doing the wrong thing, you can take appropriate action without taking offense. When you see injustice that happens in our world with sex trafficking or abortion, you can take appropriate action without picking up the burden of taking offense. Yes, there is right and there is wrong. And Jesus acknowledged all the wrong that we do, and he took it upon himself and he paid for the sins of the world. And if Jesus prayed, Father, forgive them, while he took the appropriate action of paying for the sins of the world as his followers, we are to overlook offense, to forgive sin, and to do the right thing and take appropriate action. So if you would like to live in the way that is light and is free, if you would like to live with the freedom of becoming an unoffendable person, I'm asking you to come back for every week in this series. We have 4 more parts to go. Will you come back and learn the way of Jesus that will empower you to live this way? At the end of our time, we're going to put a couple of questions on the screen. You can talk about these with whoever you're watching with, or just journal them out on your own. Question 1 is, who or what offends you? And question 2 is, what would it feel like to stop taking offense? We'll pick it up there next Sunday. Let me pray. Dear Jesus, thank you that you see all things, and you see right and wrong, and you see the wrong in our own hearts and in our own lives, and you leaned into that, and you chose to take action by dying for our sins and forgiving us from that burden. You didn't take offense, you took action, and you loved us. And you invite us into your way to follow you in the life that is free and easy from taking offense. Father, no one's going to teach this in our culture. We don't see this modeled anywhere around us except in you. So help us to live like your children. Help us to be people who can overlook offense. Because not only will this glorify you, not only will this free us from the burden of being offended all the time, this is something that can change the world. So as we move forward in this series, give us your wisdom and your freedom. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.